Hello world of YouTube. To celebrate the release of Mortal Kombat 1, the 13th entry in the long-standing fighting game franchise that is one of my personal favorites, it also is the second time that NetherRealm Studios is sort of turning back time, resetting the clock, and reevaluating the sort of roots of the story without losing sight of the broader timeline that they've still been adding to for the last 30 years. This year also marks 30 years since the home console release of the first game, but I'm not going to be looking at that original game, nor its 2011 initial reboot. Instead, I'm going to be taking a look at the soundtrack for the 1995 classic film, in my eyes, directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, Mortal Kombat. A soundtrack that was as detrimental to my early years as a child. It is an album that we had on cassette, we had on heavy rotation, and was fundamental to shaping parts and avenues of my musical tastes. I'm going to be looking at the track listing and ranking it from least to most favorite while telling you why. Overall, I feel like the soundtrack just enhances the techno-amped energy that the theme song is known for, while also having moments that lean more into the sort of burgeoning popularization of industrial music, with a lot of industrial-adjacent metal bands that have been cropping up and get some showcase on here. It's a lovely cocktail of both electronic music and that side of industrial-adjacent sounds, while having just some wild cuts in the mix, some of which have landed as some of my favorite songs of all time. I love this soundtrack. I wish I had a copy of it to have in the backdrop or to have in my hand. I realized I lost the original cassette that I had from the 90s when I lost my Pontiac, which is a damn shame. But either way, like I said, ranking worst to best. You all know the drill. If you're excited for it, give it a like, and let's go ahead and get started. Now, as you'll see by my overall ranking of the track listing by this video's end, I do prefer the front half of the soundtrack to the back half. There are still some smashes and classics strewn throughout it, though. But Biles I Reject is a textbook example, in my opinion, of just a soundtrack cut that is an immediate skip for me. It comes in the middle portion of side B and sort of feels like, or sounds like to me, the most 1995 post-industrial sounding song on a soundtrack filled with a lot of post-industrial music. It just got this flat sound that I tuned out of when I was a kid and still don't really have much interest in as an adult. It's not necessarily terrible. I think that its overall synthetic production isn't bad, but it's when the elements of like the guitars and stuff get added on there that make it sound like such just a homogenized piece of a scene. I don't know much about Bile as well. They were never a band that I got into. Even after being exposed to this song throughout my childhood, it was just never a song that really hooked me. It's also wild that this track ended up on the soundtrack, considering there were 3 Stabbing Westward songs that were left on the soundtrack. And the fact that this was considered more important to put on than those baffles me to this day. Sister Machine Gun's Burn is a decent little mid-tempo, sort of more mellow-driven track, and it has this sort of sensuality to it. A sound that sort of feels like an expansion on some of the more mellower avenues of music from like the early 90s. It's a track that I do like a sizable amount more than Biles I Reject. I think that it's got much more musically going on that I think is interesting. I love the texturing and the beat, and I think that that sort of sensuality does kind of come across in the vocal delivery, with the lyrics of sort of burning and passion and desire creeping out throughout the lyrics. It's just a song that I think, when looked at in contrast to especially a lot of the highs that I think the soundtrack reaches, it still just kind of falls up on the lower echelon of the rankings. I just also think it's kind of telling that similarly to Bile, I never really got into Sister Machine Gun in spite of having this song in my rotation being a part of a soundtrack for most of my life. the track that opens side 2 of the soundtrack, Geezer's The Invincible, is honestly kind of an interesting piece of this because it is a track that leads into a Fear Factory song, and both bands are fronted by Burton Bell, who I think is great in Geezer, and I like this song. I like the bass production on it especially. It leans into the whole Geezer Butler's Band thing, and I think that the song itself is a decent little hard rock song. I love the lead riff on this, and I think that overall it's got a sound that feels tangential to a lot of the heavy stuff on here, without it sounding too swept up in the trends that were sort of rising in hard rock and metal, especially with where pockets of this soundtrack go. It's a decent track. I think it's an interesting sort of opener for the second side. And again, an even more interesting lead into a song that, as you'll see in this ranking, I think is infinitely better. Now, as much as I love the A-side for this soundtrack, I think that closing it with the Utah Saints version of the theme song is an interesting decision. I think that given its usage of samples from the movie, and the fact that it just doesn't have that same impact as the Immortals original version, it shouldn't be at this point in the soundtrack. It feels like it should be at the end of it. It should be what closes it out. While I understand sort of waiting to give the people what they bought the soundtrack for, this is just a weird placement for this version of the song. I don't mind this version of the song. I do think that its lead synth production just isn't as impactful as the original, but I love the way that they weave the vocal samples from the movie in there. I think that the second portion of the song with the piano leads is a cool sort of tangent from the electronic energy that the original version sort of captures, while also staying indebted to that mid-90s electronic scene. I think this is a pretty solid version of the theme song, but it also just feels like it comes out in a weird place in the track listing. While maybe not having the same legacy as some of the acts that I've put on this list, I think that Mother's Day Out's What You See, We All Bleed Red is a pretty great kinetic metal jam. I think that its combination of this just fuzzy-ass riff with the rapid-fire delivery from the vocalist. I also love that weird little uneasy synth that sits in the background of pockets of the song. It just adds to the atmosphere, you know? Creates a sort of weird heavy metal version of some of the aggressive electronic stuff that crops up on here. I like this song a lot. I do think that it is a little repetitive, given that it's just kind of a small portion extended out twice, but again, that feels kind of indicative of sort of feeling like a heavy guitar-driven version of where the electronic stuff in this soundtrack lives in. It's a song that I could see ending up lower on somebody's ranking if they were ranking this soundtrack, but I've always loved the energy of this track, and I think that it's a pretty damn good sounding track from a band that, again, I just have given fuck all about outside of this one particular instance. One of the things I like about the soundtrack is that it does have some of George S. Clinton's original score also still laced in the track listing. Even if I think that they're kind of placed weirdly in the track listing, I think that if they weren't going to close with the theme song, any version of the theme song, having it close on the climax, final fight jam is a good move. And I think that this sort of has all of the accompaniment and sonic motifs and riffs that George works throughout the soundtrack and melds them all together into a really just moody and intense sort of climactic feeling track. It's got some real dramatics with some horns and some string ambience and swells. It just sort of acts as a whirlwind showcase of what you could find on the score itself if you decided to listen to it in its own sitting. I can't give enough praise to George S. Clinton's soundtrack, and you'll hear me talk about it obviously a couple more times. If I were going to pick one song to put on the bottom, it would be this, but I think that it is still a great showcasing of the greatness within the score.
I still don't know what went wrong.
This may surprise some of you, but in spite of having this song also steadily in my rotation because of the soundtrack, I never really gotten a Typo Negative. I do like this song, and I think that it is an interesting sonic pivot for this soundtrack to take. I love the organs. I love the overall sound of this version of the song. I think that the original is also really good. I don't know. Their overall brand of moody, heavy rock music just never hooked me. Maybe it will at some point in life. It's got a really good climax that it builds to. I love how intense this thing gets. It has this good climax to it, and I love how there's just this overall sense of growing intensity throughout the track. I do love Peter Steele's voice with this band. I think that they have just this overall tone that I do think is interesting, and I do think was a cool place for rock to go, at least if it sounds more like this. I know that this is probably a song that people watching this may enjoy more than I do, and that's not to say that I hate this song, but again, if we're going by my own personal feelings on this soundtrack, this winds up at this point. While enjoying the sonic pivot, just don't think it adds as much to the overall tone of the soundtrack as the rest of the more electronic driven stuff does. It's cool. It's a nice track. What more can I say? Maybe I should get it a Typo Negative. Now, Napalm Death is the first band that I have gotten into while being a part of this soundtrack, and I think the Twist the Knife Slowly, if there was going to be any Napalm Death song to be on a platinum selling soundtrack, of course it would be this one. It's still brutal as fuck. It's got that vintage blast beat coated, raw guitar driven, guttural vocal sound. And it's a classic Napalm Death song. You know, a lot of people could say it's the biggest song in the band's career, and I think it's partially because it is on, again, a soundtrack that went fucking platinum. But I think it's cool, also, just that Napalm Death is on here. Like, it's a really weird, similarly to Typo Negative, a weird pivot. Not necessarily as weird, because there's other, you know, growl-driven vocal stuff on here, but props to Napalm Death for getting on here. It's a really good song. It's a classic rip and jam. I just like some of the other tracks more, slash have more enjoyment of them from maybe that nostalgic lens, but there's just other parts of the soundtrack that I prefer, especially in the context of the soundtrack. Like the intro song for the soundtrack, A Taste of Things to Come. If we're talking about, like, sequencing a soundtrack well and integrating parts of the original score in there, A Taste of Things to Come couldn't have been a better track to showcase, or at least introduce this, because not only is it kinetic and propulsive, while also having the percussion production that George S. Clinton uses for the soundtrack, it's kind of a fun tongue-in-cheek thing to, like, introduce you to this very kinetic electronic-driven side A that the soundtrack has. It's a short little intro track, and normally these end up on the bottom of the Ranking the Songs videos, but I really like this minute-long intro that much, honestly. However, if we're talking about the George S. Clinton tracks that were included on the soundtrack, Goro vs. Art is a cool sort of meeting of the worlds. It's got the same production touch and orchestral quality that George S. Clinton was working with for this soundtrack, but it's got this guitar-driven element, a la one Buckethead of all people. This soundtrack has, like, a weird melding of creative minds, but Buckethead contributing to this just feels right, and I think is super fucking cool. That acts as a good time capsule to where sort of some guitar-driven music from the dirges of, like, virtuosic stuff that rose in the 80s evolved in the 90s. I also think that, similarly to the last song on the soundtrack, it accents that intensity that George S. Clinton reaches on the score incredibly so. I love those synthetic jabs that crop up during the various climaxes of the song, and they feel very indicative of also bringing in, like, the same impact that the Immortals theme does. It's just a really good piece of the score to include on the soundtrack for how well it fits the ideas that the soundtrack is toying with, and I think that it's also just one of the better songs on the soundtrack if we're talking like intense moments. Gravity Kills, another product of the mid-90s post-industrial metal scene that ended up on this soundtrack with the demo of their song Goodbye, and I love this version of the song. I think that the bass production is pretty choice. The balance of the electronics with their fuzzy guitars, I think, reaches a decent middle ground given it's a demo, and I think that the chorus just soars in the best way possible. I also like the little deviations the song uses to pivot into the other parts of the songs, like the little sequence that happens after the first chorus into its breakdown. This demo version is just really fucking cool, and I think that it acts as a good sort of continuation of the energy from A Taste of Things to Come, if we're talking like layout of the track listing. For as much as I love this demo version, though, I really never thought to listen to the original. Let's give it a listen.
A shadow of me, what I used to be.
This isn't it. Just scrap it. This is a mistake. If we're talking songs that grew on me the older that I got, Psychosonic's Unlearn is definitely one of those. It is a really good sort of continuation of the energy of the side A, but when I was a little kid who just loved the loud, expressive pockets of this soundtrack, this mellow, slow burn electronic track that wasn't Orbital's Halcyon just didn't quite hook me quite as much as a kid. But as I got older and I kept respinning the soundtrack, I started to really enjoy the energy that this track has. I love the various builds throughout the soundscape of the track. I think that the sort of continued harnessing of its mellow atmosphere in spite of building upon its minimal approach, I think creates a good harmony. Creates a good listen. I think that it's very much indicative of that mid-90s electronic scene, but in the best way possible. Honestly, unlike Gravity Kills, I'm kind of shocked I didn't get more into Psychosonic, given how much this song has grown on me throughout the years. I think that if you're wanting like a good, just dance track from the mid-90s, this is a pretty good one to listen to in my opinion.
The revelation. The revelation.
Now, KMFDM ending up on the Mortal Kombat soundtracks makes a lot of fucking sense. So much sense that they also ended up on the sequel soundtrack, but Juke Joint Jezebel as a track itself is a shining moment in KMFDM's discography. There's a reason why. It was kind of a relative success for them. It's a good presentation of their own brand of post-industrial electro-inspired metal rock music. But the Metropolis mix, done by one Giorgio Moroder of all motherfuckers, is the version that I knew for the longest time, and if I'm being honest, is kind of my preferred version. I love the original, and I think that it fits Niall's soundscape in particular incredibly well, but the overall shifting in parts of this song, having the lead riff come sooner, the overall ways that it strips and rearranges the track, I think just works so well. The bass being such a focus on here is also super fucking choice. I like the bass production in the original, and I like that it's used in the verses incredibly well. I love the way the chorus of this version hits. Again, I like the version of the chorus in the original, but I just love how the vocals sit in this version. It sounds so fucking good. It's just a really good adaptation on the song that I think works really well within the confines of this soundtrack. I love this version of the song, obviously because it's the one I grew up with until I got into them much later on in life. I think that if, again, I'm talking about some of the highs that the soundtrack reaches while also having just a legend in the fucking soundtrack and showcasing his abilities, this version of Juke Joint Jezebel, fucking choice. Now, the Mortal Kombat theme song is iconic, and no disrespect to the Utah Saints version, but the Immortals original is the best representation of what this franchise was built upon in its foundation. It is early 90s as fuck with its synth choices. I love the synth choices in the lead riff, the synth choices in the intro riff. I love that Mortal Kombat, it just grabs the listener. There's a reason why just the shouting of the phrase became the sole part of its marketing for both the original Armageddon and now the new version. If we're talking like the most metal sounding techno electronic song, the Mortal Kombat theme is that. It is such a good jam. While it's not my number one, it had to land high up on the list. And I don't think top 5 is all that bad. I may not know how good of a porn star she is, but Tracy Lords at least knows how to make some damn good electronic music, especially in the case of Control. While again, I like the Juno Reactor mix more because it's what's on this soundtrack, this lead riff is as good as the lead riffs on like the main Mortal Kombat theme or on Cam FDM's Juke Joint Jezebel. It's that mid-90s electronic intensity that I fucking love, and I've always loved. When I was a kid, I would fast forward to this point in the tape all the fucking time because I love this song. I think that, again, it's a really straightforward electronic jam that goes on for like 6 minutes, but all 6+ minutes have me hooked every single time. It's got a nice little build up before it just keeps the groove sailing into the sunset. I love this jam. I love what this version does at like chopping things up. It's one of those songs that just immediately hooked me and has never let go almost 30 years later. Now, I know I've talked about Fear Factory in a couple instances on the channel, but Demanufacture is one of my favorite metal albums of all time. And while I like Geezer and The Invincible well enough, Zero Signal is also my favorite song on Demanufacture. I think that it's got that nice ambience in its intro. It's a metal song with the sort of scope that rivals a sort of cinematic scale. You know, especially the drum production, it just feels larger than life, and those synths add to that grandness. I love the melody play on here. I love the lead melodies both by Burton and the riffs on the guitars. I think that the overall production on this track and Demanufacture as a whole is incredible. I may talk about them or that album at some point on this channel, but just spoilers, I'll never do a ranking the songs because Zero Signal is my favorite song on that project as a whole. That piano outro is like a piece de resistance, chef's kiss moment in the track as well. Every component of the song I think is just iconic. It captures this sort of empty mechanical feeling that feels indicative of the overall sonic palette of the soundtrack, but also lends to the themes of Demanufacture, the album itself, perfectly. My favorite song from one of my favorite metal albums. Now, Zero Signal may be my favorite song on one of my favorite metal albums of all time, but Orbital's Halcyon and On is one of my favorite songs of all time. I think if we're talking like the perfect sort of roll credits moment. I mean, there's a reason why it wasn't just used in Mortal Kombat, it was also used in Mean Girls. It's just a really great song that has this euphoric rush to its sort of very minimal, slow burn approach. It's got this pocket that it just keeps the listener in and invested in throughout its runtime. It is pure bliss, cut to wax. I love this fucking song. I think if there's a song that sounds like peace encompassed, it is Halcyon and On. It's a beautiful jam. Similarly, oddly enough to a handful of the artists on here, I never really got an Orbital, even though they just dropped a new album this year, I'm learning. If we're talking about songs that bring me the purest level of joy, Halcyon and On is one of them. It's just got this great cocktail of ideas that create this soothing atmosphere for the listener. Just a warm hug in the form of a song that I love to spin and keep on heavy rotation even to this day. And that's why it's my favorite song in the Mortal Kombat soundtrack. What do you think of the soundtrack? Do you think it's iconic? Are you excited for Mortal Kombat 1? I am. I'll be getting it soon and tearing ass through the game. But sound off in the comments. Mortal Kombat talk. This soundtrack, your favorite song. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. I'm going to go. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have a good day, lives, and situations. And I'll see you another day.